Tayven Jackson ready to transfer, not only ready to transfer, but knows where he's going as well. Thoughts?
Yeah, I almost wanted to do a video on Friday after we did the show about this. Tayven Jackson, I think this is a sign of, if I'm going to be honest, I think this is good news for Tennessee. Not losing Tayven Jackson, I think it means Nico Iamaleava was that good working with the scout team over December, because Tayven Jackson probably knew he wasn't going to beat out Joe Milton for the starting job, and you could live with that. I think he realized he wasn't going to beat out Nico in a year for the starting job.
I think that is exactly what I read into it. Not only is it Joe Milton's team right now, but I think with Nico on campus, you're able to see him spin it. And the guys I talked to are pretty blown away with the way he can spin it. So I believe that's exactly true. I think he showed up and he said, man, not only am I behind the 8 ball with Joe Milton for this upcoming season, but when am I going to play? He goes to Indiana, which I'll be honest with you, the brief times I've seen him based on his recruiting ranking, I thought he could have done better than Indiana. You?
Yeah, I guess he wanted to be closer to home. He is from there. Indiana's coach is Tom Allen, who's a defensive coordinator. So I don't know who their, he's a defensive minded coach. I don't know who their offensive coach is.
Sorry about that. Go ahead.
That's okay. So and Indiana hasn't had a winning season over the last 2 years, so I'm not sure where he was going with choosing Indiana. But I will say that I believe Walt Bell is now their offensive coordinator. He coached at UMass for a while. He was Maryland's offensive coordinator, Florida State's offensive coordinator under, I think, Mike Norvell or Willie Taggart, was it? Got a decent background as an offensive coach, so maybe he thought he could do something working with him. But yeah, I think playing close to home outweighed any coaching decision of going to Indiana. I think he wanted to go back home.
Sometimes Caleb and I talk about stuff before the show, and then sometimes I want to have his opinion be fresh and original and not really know which direction he comes from, and that maybe we get maybe we agree, maybe we don't. I think we totally agree on this one. I think Tayven Jackson saw that Nico can spin it, and I think that he was like, I'm ready to cruise on, because not only am I behind in winning the 2023 job, also behind in whatever happens going forward. So that's I think the writing's on the wall, and I think there are some like Brian Moore, there are some like Tayven Jackson, players that fans gravitate to, and that's great, and that's awesome. And you don't want to lose anybody in the portal, right? But losing Tayven Jackson, I think, is a good sign for the quarterback room, a good sign for Tennessee moving forward. That sounds like a shot at Tayven, and I've heard he's a great kid. That's the way I'm reading that right now. You?
That's exactly how I'm reading it. It's exactly how I'm reading it. So much so that if Nico made that much of an impact working with the scout team in December, which we both think he did, you're now all of a sudden maybe Joe Milton is not like the complete lockstep to start next year. Heupel said there was going to be open competition. I didn't really believe him. I thought he was sold on Milton. Jaru has talked about how it seems like he is because he's using Milton for recruiting purposes. But, if Nico's that good, they help me reminisce with me on this. This reminds me of 2004, right after Casey Clausen left. All the thought was that CJ Leak was going to be the starter. And then the first day of fall camp, Fulmer's like, no, it's going to be either Eric Ainge or Brent Schaefer. They're just that good. A part of me feels like that had more like Fulmer never really wanted to start CJ Leak, whereas Heupel wants to start Joe Milton.
Well, they wanted Chris. So if it had been 50-50, and sometimes it is, people think, no, that's a starter, no doubt. How could you make that mistake? Sometimes it really is 50-50. I think if they thought that they could have trotted CJ Leak out there, it was the year before when James Banks had the runaround game in Athens and almost won, right?
Yeah, 2 years. That was 2002.
Okay. So let's go back to that point, and here's what they thought of CJ Lee. So they didn't think CJ Lee could play at the SEC level. That's why they had the James Banks run around offense. Well, at the time, Chris Leak's parents and Chris Leak were sitting in the stands at Athens watching this, and that was the very moment that he was not coming to Tennessee because they went with him instead of CJ Leak, which would have been the more conventional way of going after him. And by the way, you mentioned that Miami win down there as one of Philip Fulmer's best coaching jobs. I thought that one of his best coaching jobs was actually that day in Athens to have the James Banks running around, kind of Lamar Jackson type of offense, and that kept them in the game. And it ended up being a one-score game very late. I think Georgia won by 4 points. So I think that said everything you needed to know. So at that point, you want to keep CJ Leak around for depth. You want to keep him around in case you have to go to him. But Philip Fulmer is always going to side. He's going to err on the side of talent, and that's Eric Ainge. Eric Ainge can obviously spin it. Could at the time, big, strong-armed NFL prototype quarterback, and then you had Brent Schaefer that could run around and do some things, and still had a great arm. So I think it really goes back to they kind of strung CJ Leak along to be a backup even headed into that Ainge Schaefer season. That was always my thought of it. I never thought that he would go into that season as the starter. I just never got the feeling that they would find somebody else. And unless Schaefer and Ainge ended up being dodo birds, which they one was, unless they both just absolutely blew up and were horrible. I don't think CJ Leak was ever going to start a real game at Tennessee in which there wasn't an injury in front of him that opened the door. And I don't think he did he?
No, and the crazy part is Ainge and Schaefer both got season-ending injuries that year, and then they went with Rick Clausen, not even CJ Leak. And
that was 2005, correct?
No, 2000. Remember that the quarterback controversy with Ainge and Clausen was 05 because Clausen finished out the year in 2004. And Clausen finished out the year because Schaefer got hurt against South Carolina, and then Ainge got hurt against Notre Dame, I believe. And so they had to finish Clausen started the SEC championship game when they lost to Auburn that year, and then was MVP of the Cotton Bowl, I think.
Oh golly, man!
Yeah.
The press box with no heat. I'll always remember about that Cotton Bowl. And Jimmy Himes, congratulations to him on his retirement. But I still remember us walking across the ice, and I think he busted once because it was an ice storm. I took all spring clothes to Dallas. Didn't you think it would be warm? Got there the first day, stood there at SMU's campus for practice, and there's something about a breeze that comes through in a place with no mountains, and it just cuts. I could feel my skeleton. I mean, it cuts straight to the bone. But no, I think the Leak relationship between that administration went south pretty quick, and it was that day in Georgia. So, CJ also was a little bit of a weird bird. He didn't want to be. He just kind of hung around, but it was you weren't sure if he was really fully engaged. Like he didn't want to do interviews a lot, and I'm not judging that, but kind of felt like he thought he was screwed over, for lack of a better term, and maybe he was, but I think the way he responded to it wasn't good. But I know they fell in love with Ainge and Schaefer and their physical ability, and I mean, golly, looking back at it, who couldn't?